This afternoon's session, as Tim said, is going to focus on environmental problems, barriers, and possible solutions in specific fields: water, energy, habitat, corporate management. In setting up that discussion and following on from the survey that we just heard about, this panel is going to take a step back. And we're going to reflect both on the survey's findings, but more generally on the role of environmental attitudes, values, and behavior in America today. I mean, fundamentally, it seems to me these are really what drive environmental protection. Why do we care about environmental problems? How do we care about them? How much do we care about them? As the speakers just made clear in the last presentation, virtually every survey over the last 20 years has shown that Americans care, or say they care, about environmental protection. But what does this actually mean in terms of actual behavior? How does saying, I want to protect the environment, become more substantive, more meaningful than saying, I'm patriotic? All right, what does that actually mean in practice? And the fundamental question that we're going to address is not just how does this play out in the voting booth, but how does it play out in other aspects of personal behavior in terms of charitable donations, community engagement, personal activities. We're now 35 years on from the birth of the modern era of environmental law and policy, and the question is, where are we going? We've got a terrific panel to consider these and other issues, and what's really exciting, and I mean no disrespect to the panel, we've got even greater expertise and knowledge in the audience. And so what we're hoping to do is have a discussion not only amongst ourselves, but also to include your perspectives and views on these issues. So what we'll have is presentations from some of the panelists, discussion, and sort of move around these issues from different perspectives. And I encourage you to get involved, sort of asking questions and making comments as well. So I'll start off with Nicole St. Clair. Nicole is at NRDC, where she's in charge of communications for the climate project there. Prior to that, she worked with Ceres, which is a group that works on corporate social responsibility. It grew out of the Valdez principles. And while she was there, Nicole focused particularly on making climate change a boardroom issue for companies, and getting the financial press interested in climate change as an issue that they should report on. Nicole?
Thank you. I'm Nicole St. Clair, and I'm a compromiser. I think. Although I don't like the word compromiser because it sounds like I'm willing to trade things off for each other, and or that I can't make a decision, or I could go either way. But the reason I was drawn to that description when I was reading through the descriptions that they gave me a couple weeks ago was because when you actually looked through what they said about the compromisers, they said that they were concerned about all of these things. They're concerned about the environment, they're concerned about jobs, they're concerned about health. And I think that they're onto something there, that as we've heard from so eloquently from so many people today, that when we talk about the environment, we're not talking about an issue that's separate and apart from ourselves. We're talking about the way we interact with the world. We're talking about the way we manage our lives personally. There are a lot of parallels in how we would manage our own finances or our family or our planning or our homes. And I think that translates into some practical understandings people have of how we might want to manage the natural world and live with it, benefit from it, be a part of it. So I've always felt that way for some reason ever since I was a little kid. I look back and realize that I was into the third way when I was in about third grade, but I didn't know that. So the reason I've gone into communications for me has sometimes been less about trying to convince people that they should care and more about trying to find the way to demonstrate those connections and really elevate our understanding of how the environment and the economy and our lives intersect. So I'll talk a little bit specifically about this poll in a minute, but one thing that struck me when I looked at the poll, and I've certainly participated in a lot of these kind of polling exercises, is, and I think we learned from each of them, but I think what's interesting is the way we set up the question in the polls, given that all of us share the vision, the holistic, connected vision that I've just described and that I've heard other people describe today. We go about it by separating the environment out as an issue and then asking people about it. And what I find pleasing, actually, And we often find discouraging is that, people go along and they're saying everything we want them to say. Yes, I really care about it. And yes, it really matters to me. And sometimes they'll even volunteer why it matters to them for all kinds of reasons that we would applaud. I care about my kids' health, or I'm worried about global warming, or whatever it is. And then they get to that last question that we ask them. So would you vote on it? And I think my view, and I would love to hear from the pollsters, is that that confuses people a little bit. Because the it, and when it's defined that way, seems separate suddenly from everything that they just described. So I think our challenge is to notice what they are telling us, which is actually quite bright. And we're missing, instead of our thinking, I find that we always think, oh, we didn't teach them. We need to teach them. We need to give everybody a test. We always say, okay, so what's global warming? And people say, well, it's pollution, and I think comes from cars, and we'll be saying, exactly. And then, they'll trip, and they'll say, and I think it's related to the ozone. And when people say things like that, we get all upset. Oh, they don't get it. And we have to explain it, and we have to maybe design some more brochures, or have a campaign. Or we should have a website, that really, really helps them get it. And I think we're ignoring an emerging reality that is right before our noses, and that is inherent in what they're telling us, that all these other things matter to them. So I'll just describe for you what I see, and this is just me, but what I see is that emerging reality, and what I even call sometimes to myself the emerging strike zone, that I think is right in front of us. And I think the very reality of the people that are in this room that are ready to roll up their sleeves and get working on this speaks to that emerging reality and that emerging strike zone. So on the one side, I see it as being that the environment, energy, issues of natural resources, pollution, concerns, is actually one of the major drivers of commerce today. If you look at any media right now, if you look in Investor's Business Daily to Business Week to Fortune Magazine to the Wall Street Journal to anything, almost any story you see has a often quite obvious environmental component. We're in a world now where there are emerging superpower, emerging super economies of China and India who are developing themselves. They're not catching up to us. They're not starting in 1970 where we were. They're not starting in a world where there are abundant resources, where there are only a few nations who are capable of really extracting and using them. They're not in a place where there's no knowledge of what pollution does and how it affects public health and quality of life and all those other things. So they're merging into a world where environmental factors are what used to be external factors in the value of a company, and they're now becoming quite internal. I think the United States is slowly starting to notice that, but we're not quite there yet. And actually, I take that back. I actually think a lot of the United States is starting to get that. I think there's a very small and powerful minority who are holding us back from seeing that. And I think that's a real opportunity. I was talking with a Business Week editor the other day, and we were talking about some of the great covers we've seen in the last couple of years. The innovation economy came from Business Week. There's been a bunch of end of oil, all those different things. But we talked about, a cover that said it's the environment, stupid. That's explaining how it's sort of the crux of everything we're doing. So anyway, so that's on the sort of the emerging reality on the corporate side that I think is really important and exciting if we drive it forward. On the public side, people deeply know that something is wrong, both environmentally. I feel like on global warming, no, people can't always explain it to me the way my policy guys would like them to be able to explain it. But they notice, and I can't tell you how many times people just will remark to me, cab drivers will remark on things are changing, it's warm, it's weird, so these are very unscientific observations. It's weird, birds aren't here the way they used to be, or this isn't the way it used to be, or this lake isn't as high as it used to be, or whatever it is. I think there's something in there, and that's what great politicians do. They don't explain things to people to the point where they can articulate it to you. They dig right on in to a deeper feeling of worry or concern or something people have noticed and draw it out. I think the other piece of that we sort of forget to look at is people are really worried about our economy, and when we see major industrial giants in this country, and we've seen such a major transition away from manufacturing, from engineering, people know something's wrong there. When Ford Motor Company and General Motors are junk bonds, something's wrong. And we're not leading. We're not leading the world. We're not creating jobs. We're not creating a safe environment for people here. When you combine that with high gas prices, fears in the West about the degradation of land out there, what you start to see emerge, I think, is a solid this or that narrative. And I loved that was pointed out in the poll, that instead of having these, all these issues that people need to worry about, on top of all the other issues they need to worry about that are quite compelling around the world, that we start to put forward a vision of progress and redefining progress, which is actually the name of a group in California, but redefining progress to be about what we instinctively know is not only smart business, but good for the environment, being efficient, being innovative, being competitive with the rest of the world, or holding us back from progress. And that, to me, encompasses all of these things, like global warming, which I see as almost a market signal that something needs to change, drilling, mercury poisoning, all the sort of negative effects of the old way, the 19th century extraction ways, just for one aspect of environmental issues, that once propelled us forward into an enormously, wonderfully new quality of life, and now are holding us back from that next exciting transition and that next exciting propelling of ourselves into the next exciting century of innovation. And I think when you combine all that with fear and even just sort of a natural American competitiveness that we may be lagging behind the rest of the world, I just think that presents a very ripe situation for us to not go out and talk about the environment, but to raise these questions and raise these issues in a way that can turn into election results. How do we do that? Part of what I think about a lot is I think about our desire to explain, because so many of us are familiar with science. We care about logic. We love reasoning, and I work with lawyers and scientists, so it's facts and reasoning. But if we lived in a logical world, it would be very different. We see that. But I think sometimes it's more about changing, assuming that everyone's with us, assuming deeply that people care as they say they do in all these polls, and shifting the burden of proof to ask questions of those who may be holding back that progress as we have defined it, and asking them, how is it that in doing all this and pursuing these strategies, you're really setting us up in the right way for, and then it can be whatever entree people need for job creation, for protection of land, for whatever their entree is. So at Ceres, this is something that'll be a little bit uncomfortable for some of the corporate people in the room, but I think it's important to talk about. I worked with a group that was founded on these ideas of corporate social responsibility, as it used to be called, which I think is also something that implies that it's external. But we started to work with major public pension funds who started to worry about carbon dioxide emissions being something that would be a liability for major polluting companies, or major emitters, I should say, as the world starts to move away from carbon dioxide emissions. And so we termed something called climate risk, which I thought was really interesting, because the idea of risk, once you ask about risk and how you're managing risk, you've shifted the burden of proof to the other person to say, oh, no, I'm managing this right. We then turned that question into an actual form, which was a shareholder resolution, which is something that shareholders can bring before the company, requesting more information on how management is handling a particular issue. The first such resolution was filed with some electric power companies by the State of Connecticut Pension Fund. And what was really interesting about that is we ended up working on those with electric power companies and auto companies and oil companies. Astounding number of shareholders. It was like in the high 20s and 30%, which is very, very high for a so-called environmental resolution. voted in favor of asking those companies to give reports on how it was they were planning for the future for a carbon-constrained world. So what we did was we turned this sort of environmental issue and pulled it right down into business. And I liked it because in the beginning I would call the Wall Street Journal and say, I want to talk about global warming, and they'd say, what, lady? You know, this is what we talk about. And they started returning our calls. But what that led to, actually, it's an adversarial thing to do, but what it led to both before the filing and after the filing were deeper discussions with those companies, many of which actually on their own had individuals in those companies who were already examining this risk, who were already looking at it, and maybe had been a little bit constrained in the public policy arena from really going forward with talking about it more, but were able to talk about it in the financial sector in a way that could be sort of construed as appropriate. So anyway, just to end quickly, or to pose a question, I think that we need to broaden that out. That was a very sort of narrow financial world example. I think it would be interesting to talk about how we what we start to call this kind of vision, this kind of living. You know, there's the innovation economy from Business Week. There are words that got tossed around like smart and clean and all those things. I think it's very important to think about what the vernacular of the 21st century might be for pursuing the kind of vision that we're seeking. So thank you.
Building off that, I'm curious to just pose a quick question to the panel. I mean, Nicole's story about the taxi driver sort of reminded me of something that came up in the survey discussion, which is the difference between saliency, saying, gosh, it seems warmer, things are changing, and intensity. You know, they've got to move on this. And I guess the question is, how do you take these environmental issues? I mean, it's got to be a good sign, right? The taxi drivers know what climate change is. But how do you make that meaningful in terms of their own behavior?
I've been talking for a long time. You should talk.
You want me to go ahead with the presentation? Or?
Actually,
yeah, I think because I really will have something I want to say as dean of another school, which is very much a pea in a pod with the Nicholas School here, and that is how excited I am about this celebration, how pleased I am with the fact that that we will be working together with Bill and with Tim and others at Yale, and the high expectations that we have for this collaboration and for the Institute and for the school. I think very much the type of school that we offer to the world is extraordinarily important for the future. And we really need to all succeed. And I think that all of our schools, whether it's the Nicholas School or the school at Yale or the Bren School in California or at Michigan, the School of Natural Resources, we will all rise and fall or fall together. And we desperately need to rise for the sake of the future, because the type of environmental professional that we can train at these schools and the type of work that the Institute can do to bridge beyond the school into the policy process is so fundamentally important that we really need to collaborate. So I am delighted that we have been doing a number of things together recently, and we want to keep that going in the future. We'll do some joint promotional activities among our schools, and just want to wish Tim and Bill all the best for the future. We're just delighted about this initiative, and of course, insanely jealous also.
I've been remiss. I'm sure this is a man who needs no introduction, but this is Gus Speth, who's the dean of the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, co-founder of Natural Resources Defense Council, head of the Council on Environmental Quality under Jimmy Carter, founder of the World Resource Institute, administrator of UNDP. I can go on, but
all my groups do better after I leave them. And when Russ Train was talking this morning, one has to go back and remember that very early moment when he was at CEQ and things were really just getting started, and I was helping to start the Natural Resources Defense Council. And a gentleman in the audience, a Duke graduate named Brent Blackwell, that came to me and said, you really have to take on this stream channelization issue. The Soil Conservation Service is ditching every stream, and it's in your region of the South, and you've got to go down there and stop them. And so we did, actually, in the end. But we began by launching a project. And, of course, it turned out that the very same Jamie Whitten was the principal promoter of these ditches that were ruining our streams and rivers across the country. And he took the floor of the House one day and made a statement that I'll never forget. He said, we have to do this stream channelization, this channelization of our rivers. If we don't do it, they will tend to meander. And so much for science and the Congress. These problems are not new. I was reminded also when I was listening to Russ Train that, you know, there was a moment in which a basin in the Arkansas, the Cache River Basin, was severely threatened by a Corps of Engineers project. And the Environmental Defense Fund sued the bastards to stop them from ditching the Cache River. And that issue went to the Council on Environmental Quality when Russ Train was there. And among all, he contributed enormously to undoing that project and ended up creating, in the long run down there, a National Wildlife Refuge. And of course, that's where we found the ivory bill the other day. So never forget the importance of environmental advocacy and the importance of litigation when it's needed, and the importance of having this partnership between the NGOs that can raise issues and people in government that you can deal with effectively, which I'm afraid we don't have today. Well, there are a couple of things that I thought that could be also brought out about the disconnect that Peter and Bill spoke about and presented so dramatically to us. Another point which they have uncovered is that the public often doesn't feel like that it can do something about these issues beyond recycling and things of that type. When they have an image of protecting the environment, they think it's somebody else doing it. They don't see themselves in that picture that much. Another factor in this disconnect, I think, is that the environmental community has, in a sense, contributed to its own problems. I don't mean to blame the victim, and I think of myself very much in that community, but the public today has a very mixed picture of environmentalists, and there are a great many people who want not to be too closely associated with something called environmentalist, and there are some people who see political gain in actually campaigning against the environment. There's sort of red meat to their constituencies, and so I think that we have to keep in mind. This issue that they brought out, that the public sees a consistent trade-off between the economy on the one hand and the environment on the other, is nothing less than an indictment of 30-plus years of environmental education and environmental advocacy. I mean, if we have that problem pervasive today in our politics, and it suggests that we have really failed to communicate the underlying reality of the environment economy issue. We have truly failed to bring that, and now we struggle with it. Peter and Bill mentioned that things are different today than they were in the early 1970s when Russ Train and I started out in this area. And I just want to underscore, it is so dramatically different today. So many things are different today. A group recently had a celebration of the success of our one big international effort, and that is to protecting the ozone layer. And they went back at that celebration and showed the footage of Walter Cronkite talking about that issue on CBS News in the 1970s. And their jaws went slack because it was so different from the type of coverage that you get today. It was intense, it was repeated, it was lengthy, and he told the whole story in a way that really motivated people, to the point that people voluntarily stopped using the spray cans that had the chlorofluorocarbons in them. Another huge difference, if you look at the League of Conservation Voters ratings of the Congress, you see that back in that era, the Republicans and the Democrats were very close together in their votes as ranked by the League. And now, that over the years, that gap has just widened and widened, to the point that I don't want to sound partisan, but it is, frankly, if you look at what they've done, their analyses, it's hard to find a Democrat with a bad environmental voting record, and it's hard to find a Republican with a really good one. And it's striking what's happened to the way, and there's a lot of blame to go around, but frankly, if you go back and look at the famous Lewis Powell memo that really started this very right-wing, ultra-conservative, strongly anti-government, Grover Norquist type approach to Washington, it was started back then some decades ago, and it has now grown to the point that it is the sort of ruling ideology in our country. And from its very beginning, it was anti-regulation, it was anti-government, and the big issues that were taking off that drew their attention to these issues in the first place was environmental regulation. And it's had a strongly anti-environmental streak in it from the very beginning, as Richard Lazarus's recent book, among others, brings out. So how do we make sense of this disconnect in the biggest picture? I think there's an issue that needs to be brought out. There's been a fundamental difference between the Earth Day issues of 1970 and the global scale issues which emerged, say, 15 years later into the public agenda. The Earth Day issues were local, they were in your face, they were acute, you didn't need the great technical sophistication to understand them, you didn't need a lot of foresight to understand them, you didn't need a lot of science to understand them. People knew how bad things were. You knew how bad things were in the 60s and leading up to this pouring out of environmental action and legislation in the 70s. Well, we then did all those things. We created this fool's paradise for ourselves in our country, giving all of us and most of the people and overwhelmingly the people in the country the impression that we've made progress, that we continue to make progress, that things are better, and indeed they are. Meanwhile, this global scale agenda, which is more threatening, more serious, more problematic, more chronic, more difficult to understand, more technical in its details, it's out there, it's in the future, it's remote. Global warming is the paradigm instance of this, but there are other huge problems that we're neglecting, like this tremendous loss of biodiversity and ecosystem services, and the public doesn't get it. And the polls show that global warming is at the bottom of an environmental list of concerns, which is at the bottom of a public list of concerns. And we have badly, badly failed to communicate these global scale issues in a way that resonates with people. And it's finally beginning to change. It's beginning to change in part because global climate change is beginning to be visible to people. And we are seeing some immediacy in the issue. But I think there's a fundamental set of problems here that I hope the Nicholas Institute will address. We're seeing major changes, as Nicole said, in private companies, in state and local action, 185 cities committing to implement the Kyoto Protocol. Will they actually do it? We don't know. But that is a huge step forward in itself. Over half the states doing something now to address the climate issue. Things are changing, but it's slow and it's late on climate, and it's going to require much deeper public understanding and commitment when we get to the point where it really begins to be serious. And we have to put legislation out there or action at some level to change the way that we do transportation, to change the way we do energy production. And we're going to need a much more profound and deeper public understanding of these global scale issues than we have today. I think the Katrina event and perhaps this new one coming at Texas or we'll create a teachable moment where we can deepen public understanding. I think we need a $100+ million public education campaign in our country, very sophisticated to reach the public because we don't have time to do anything, any other way of teaching. But we also have to go back and do something we haven't done for 30 years, and that is invest more seriously in environmental education at all levels of schooling, because we're paying a tremendous price today. If you look at the surveys that have been done on energy and environmental literacy in our country, it's terribly disturbing. And we've got to really invest in environmental education in a way that we've badly, badly neglected for decades. So we're up against the wall. We have some really true crisis situations in biodiversity loss, ecosystem services loss, climate disruption. And we've got to put a new energy into this to have really a bottom-up movement in our country for change. And we've got to get beyond this barrier that is so prevalent out there today in not understanding these issues deeply and profoundly and not understanding the basic science. Cornelia Dean, and I'll finish with this, was the editor of the Tuesday Science Times in the New York Times, and she's gone back to being a reporter now. And I think she wanted to get a message across to the American public about this issue. And so she did what journalists have to do and found someone who personified this issue and who could make this message come alive. And she wrote a story about it in the New York Times on August the 30th. And let me read you the first couple of paragraphs. When John D. Miller looks out across America, which he can do from his 18th floor office at Northwestern University Medical School in Chicago, how she found the gentleman, I don't know. He sees a landscape of haves and have-nots, not in terms of money, but in terms of knowledge. Dr. Miller, 63, a political scientist who directs the Center for Biomedical Communication at the medical school, studies how much Americans know about science and what they think about it. And his findings are not encouraging. While scientific literacy has doubled in the past 2 decades, only 20 to 25% of Americans are scientifically savvy and alert, he said in an interview. Most of the rest don't have a clue, and that's a quote. At a time when science, and this is what she really wanted to communicate, and I want to bring up, at a time when science permeates debates on everything from global warming to stem cell research, he said, people's ability to understand basic scientific concepts undermines their ability to take part in the democratic process. This is a fundamental threat to our democracy. Thank you very much.
You want to go now? Okay. Thank you, Gus. I think what we'll do is have Michael go next, and then we can have some discussion on the floor after that. Michael comes with a lot of experience from Capitol Hill. He's a founder of the Patriot Group. He was a chief of staff for this state senator, Libby Dole, and has worked for other senators. He also has been involved in the executive branch. He was on the transition team for Bush Cheney and also worked on the campaign.
It's not lost on me that you put me on the far right here. I was very excited when Tim first called and asked me to come down here and take part on this panel. He opened up by saying that he would ask me to bring some balance to the panel. I told him I'd be glad to drag my knuckles across the stage. And he quickly backtracked and said, context. And I think that the two are very, very interconnected. And I think that you have to take a look at the contexts in which we find ourselves through these environmental debates. It is absolutely critical to understanding where we are and how to move. I would point out 3 very interrelated contexts that I want to just chat about real quick, which are economic context, global context, and a political context. When you look at what drives a person to vote or to act in everyday life, I think you can focus on 3 or 4 primary drivers that are going to have to be met before anything else gets met, and those are going to be safety, food, shelter. You have to have money in order to secure those things, and you have to have a job to get money. And until a person has a safe environment in which to live and has food, has a house, has a job, he's not going to focus on, other abstract notions, global, policies or public goods, things along those lines. And so for you to understand how people vote in Washington, or how corporations vote in terms of where they're going to put their companies and how they're going to act, you've got to understand what those primary drivers are. And I think from an industry standpoint, in terms of their economic priorities, they're going to look for certainty. They want to know that when they build a plant, there will be a need, for the product that they do. They want to know that they have supplies. They want a stable regulatory environment, things along those lines. And also profits. Nobody starts a company to create jobs, except maybe GM now. But you start a company to make a profit or to make a gadget which other people will then buy. And if you have environmental initiatives that are going to fundamentally clash with those 2 points that the industries are looking for, they're going to oppose it. I think that if you can have a regulatory initiative that will not affect certainty or will not necessarily dramatically hurt profits, most industries are going to go along with that, and they're going to be fairly comfortable with it. They do want to be good stewards in the community. But if you are going to put on an initiative that is going to put them out of business or is going to make their regulatory or their labor or their supply markets wildly erratic, they're going to oppose that. And that may be something nobody in this room likes, but it is definitely there, and you have to be cognizant of it as you start to engage in these debates. Looking at a global context, I think that the same way that an individual is going to focus on his or her own economy and job status, safety, things along those lines, countries will do the same thing. The emerging economies right now, China, India, Africa, Middle East, and Central America, they're focused on production, and they're focused on jobs, and they want electricity, and they want their people to, have jobs, things along those lines. And the more established economies, such as the United States, where we've got all those things in place, and we've had those things in place for 50, 80, 100, 200 years in certain areas, then we can focus on outside issues like the environment and being good stewards of the community and things along those lines. And that if you look at a country or a company in industry, and they are going to look at how China is going to regulate industry, how China is going to provide an energy supply or price, how China is going to do its labor supply and price, or their regulatory environment, and that is substantially more beneficial to a company, then they are going to move over to China. And they're going to avoid all the different regulatory regimes that we have in place here. And sometimes people will think that that's really good. Sometimes people will think that's really bad. That's not what we're here to discuss, but you do need to at least acknowledge that absent the economic drivers being in place here for companies, they will definitely want to go overseas. And third, a political context. I would note, and Tim and I had many, many discussions about this in Washington, that every interest in Washington is a special interest. As Senator Dole's chief of staff, I viewed North Carolina as a special constituency. And it didn't matter what part of the state you were from, you were a constituent and your interests were special interest. Conversely, the environmental movement is very much a special interest, as are industry stakeholders. And there are more special interests up in Washington than you can shake a stick at. And there is a side to every debate. I've always argued that if you said motherhood, baseball, apple pie is all American, that, NARAL would oppose you, that the cherry growers would oppose you, and that the NFL would oppose you. There are give and takes, and there's every side to every issue up there. Contrary to what everybody else has kind of pointed at earlier, I would argue that environmental issues are a very high priority in Washington right now. There are 435 offices in Congress that have an environmental staffer. You have the EPA, which is very engaged in policy matters. You have DOE, you have CEQ, you have all these different things. We spend an inordinate amount of time discussing environmental policy up in Washington. It is not forgotten, I assure you. And it's not forgotten on the Republican side of the aisle, and I'm pretty sure it hadn't been forgotten on the Democrat side of the aisle. You know, it is a very live debate, and I think that it is a high priority debate up there. When you look at how the debate has kind of been taken on right now, I think it's important for you to note when you're looking at individual economic priorities for individuals, such as jobs, such as money, such as safety, things along those lines, there is no politician in the world who will trade short-term pain for long-term gain. They just won't do it. If you go to somebody and say, we want you to vote for this initiative because we think at some point it may be good, but it'll put 50,000 of your constituents out of work, he won't do it. If he does, he won't be back. And that drives a whole lot of debate up there. And I think that it's very critical for you to note that the environment as a wedge issue, and you pointed that out earlier, has really fundamentally been divisive in terms of trying to get anything done. You know, Republicans have figured out that they can talk about jobs and they can talk about the economy and they'll have pretty success. And Democrats have figured out that they can talk about the environment, and they have driven it as a wedge issue over the last 15 years very effectively, which is going to produce a stalemate, and you're not going to get anything done. I'm probably the only one in the room right now who would argue that the McCain-Lieberman bill doesn't have a chance to pass, primarily because as long as folks are refusing to talk about the issues and they're shouting back and forth at each other and they're getting elected on one side or other of the issue, there really is not going to be any debate. And if there's not any debate, you're not going to get any policy changes. You're not going to get any legislation for it. And you can argue about the merits of the bill all you want, but absent a political, policy dialogue that is truly effective and takes in every one of those special interests that are up in Washington, you're not going to be able to get anything done. I'm the biggest fan of our government in certainly the room, probably, if not North Carolina, because I do think that if you care about an issue, you can go up to Washington and you can influence the policy debate. You don't have to have money. You don't have to have numbers of people. You have to really care and you have to engage. But if you do engage, then you can be very effective. And the environmental movement has been very effective, I think, at doing that. Obviously, so have industry stakeholders and, trade folks and job folks and everybody else, which is why we're where we are. But the thing that I'm so excited about with your starting this institute is that, Tim and I spent an inordinate amount of time trying to figure out how Senator Voinovich and Senator Lieberman can actually get together and come up with a bill, and then we both decided that nobody else in Congress would vote for it, so we went back and threw rocks at each other. But this is very constructive, and I think that Tim's been very wise in making sure that all of the interests from an economic context and a global context and a political context are put on the table and acknowledged. And it may very well be that nobody likes the fact that the environment is a wedge issue, but you have to acknowledge it in order to actively try and move beyond that.
Okay. Before we move to Paul's comments, who's going to focus on this issue in a slightly different context, I thought it might be a good chance to get a few questions or comments from the room on what's been said. Any? Mm-hmm.
I'd like to ask a question going back to the poll this morning. I was very impressed with the number one factor that seemed to drive people was concern for future generations. And my question is, how does that square with trying to be more focused, more immediate? How does one take that enthusiasm and drive and concern about future generations and translate that into something people will rally around.
Did everyone hear the question? No. The question was, to boil it down, the survey results this morning showed the concern for future generations was seen as a high priority for many of those who were surveyed. And the question is, how do you take something which by definition is a long-term concern and make it an immediate concern? Is that?
Well, I have some doubts about the public's concern about the long term. There's some, interpreting poll results is not my business, and I don't know much about it. But among the registered voters, 99% of the respondents said they were going to vote in the next election in the poll. So you get a lot of sort of answers that people would like you to think about themselves. And I think concern about future generations is unfortunately one of those things. There was a different poll that, I think all these polls are very valuable. This one was an ABC Washington Post poll in June of 2005. And it said that 6 in 10 Americans think global warming is underway, and just as many, 6 in 10, accept that human activities are responsible for it. But like the Bush administration, most part company with the scientists' call for prompt action. That lack of urgency stems from perceptions of the hazards. While a vast majority, nearly 8 in 10, believe that global warming will pose a serious threat to future generations, far fewer, just 1/3, think it will affect their own lives, and the majority who see the risk as distant overwhelmingly prefer study to immediate action. So that got into this issue of concern about future generations in a different way. I think the thing that was mentioned by Peter and Bill, that we have to make these issues immediate, is absolutely right. And so we need to take these teachable opportunities like Katrina disaster to do that. And we need a much better conveyor belt between what scientists are finding out about global warming and what actually gets to the public. If you actually read, as I'm sure many, many people in this room do, Science and Nature, or even geophysical research letters and some other things, what you see is a fire hose of scary, devastating information coming out about things, about climate-related things. Greenland glaciers moving at 3 times the normal speed and thinning out, the Arctic, and it's just 85% of the Patagonian glaciers in sharp retreat. And it's really scary what's going on. It does not reach the public. We need a new way of bridging between the science and getting information to the public. Right now, you get things into Science Times or something, or occasionally into New York Times, but it really is a very pathetic conveyor belt now.
And I think it's worth note that if you were to go out and poll the 550,000 people who've been displaced by Hurricane Katrina, that their primary issues would be food and water, my family, are they alive? I need a house, how am I going to pay for this? I guarantee you that there's not a single person in that 550,000 that if you said, what do we need to do for you right now, not a single person is going to say, we need more strict controls on coal-fired power plants. When we deal with those immediate primary economic priorities and lifestyle priorities, then we will have the opportunity to step back. It doesn't really matter what the New York Times says we need to do, because I guarantee you none of those people are reading the New York Times right now.
And Nicole, just to follow up, you're the communications person for the climate project at NRDC. How do you avoid the Chicken Little sort of fear-mongering label that's been put on a lot of environmental groups?
I don't know. I'm working on it. But one thing I was going to say, actually, I was thinking before you brought it up about your point about people needing shelter first, or their own safety first. We did a poll a few years ago where it was actually, it wasn't a poll, it was a focus group, and it was talking to blue-collar auto supply workers, I think I want to say Milwaukee, but I'm not sure if there's auto supply there. But anyway, Midwestern blue-collar auto supply workers. And first they talked to them about global warming, and they was like, well, you know, I don't know about the sun, I don't know. And they were sort of agnostic on whether it was real and whether it was really something to be worried about and whatever. Well, then they talked about, you know, what do you think about Detroit and innovation and blah, blah, blah. And then there's all kinds of outrage. You know, Detroit could be making cars that ran on water if they wanted to, and they're just not doing it, you know. And, you know, they're not competing with Japan, and they're not doing this and whatever. And what would you know, so there was talk about whether they would like better technology that would preserve jobs. So they got very animated, you know, about that we're not competing with Japanese, we could be competing with Japanese, we could be keeping jobs here, et cetera, et cetera. And then, on their own, two of their respondents circled back and said, and that would solve your global warming problem. And I think that's fascinating, because I feel like that speaks to my instinct, which is that people do get that something's happening, but also to Michael's observation that it's not what they take to their everyday lives, but they're so delighted if it all comes together. So I think we need to think about more ways to bring those pieces together.
I have a crack, which I may expand, sort of a comment, which was just, it goes to the question of polling, at which I understand and respect and work with. But I was moved to say that if immediate short-term interests were the only thing discussed at courts among courtiers, we would still be living with the divine right of kings. And likewise, slavery. So let it be part of our discussion to understand that as focused as we are on these short-term questions, as I'll try to say shortly, the nature of the issues we're addressing here is immense, comprehensive, long-term, about the nature and future of human understanding of place and purpose on the planet. Not easily discussed in the news cycle and within legislative schedules. But I'll amplify when the time comes.
Okay. One more question or comment, sir?
We read a lot about the water that's being pumped back into Lake Pontchartrain and how polluted it is and all the next toxic. Is there a teachable moment here of what could have been done, or are we just so concerned with the immediacy of building the dikes and reducing the water in New Orleans that that's the only thing we can do? I mean, is this an example of short-term versus long-term, or in fact, are there any long-term consequences for Lake Pontchartrain that we need to worry about?
Again, did folks hear the question back there? No, the question, I think, essentially was, how teachable is Katrina? The gentleman was using the example of pumping polluted water back into Lake Pontchartrain. Is that something we can make use of? I think it builds also off of Michael's comments about really, is this actually teachable or not, and who's going to be listening?
Just off the top of my head, I would say yes, it's a very important issue, whether or not we're pumping treated water back into Pontchartrain or polluted water back into Pontchartrain. I think everybody would argue, or everybody that you talk to would say, that's huge, that's very important. Okay, well, do you want to have the water sit in New Orleans for 4 more weeks while we figure out a treatment system? Not a single person would go there. So, we're fortunate that there are very few examples that are that diametrically opposed. We do have opportunities for education. We do have opportunities, I think, talk about the dikes. We're going to rebuild those dikes, but I think it's very important that we rebuild them in a way that will, be better for the environment, that will be stronger, that will do all these different things, because what we had clearly didn't work. So we don't want to just throw the same stopgap thing up, but we can use that opportunity to figure out how better to do it.
I think that's the other important point, is that people are absorbing a lot of information from this disaster. They're absorbing a lot of immediate information and emotion, but then people who are responsible for taking care of this in the months and years to come, had a shock of recognition of environmental problems, descending on them, from the toxics problem to the decisions that were made about wetlands to even in a long-term way global warming. And I don't think people forgot that. I think we really have to trust that people absorb more than we think they do and start there. And I think that as decisions are made moving forward, it's going to be important to keep bringing that back up and reminding people, but I don't think it's going to be like starting from scratch to educate them because they saw it firsthand.
I've been charged with bringing us at least close to back to schedule in this time zone. And so what I'll do is turn to Paul Gorman. And Paul is the founder and the head of the National Religious Partnership for the Environment, which includes the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, the National Council Church, the Evangelical Network, and the Coalition on Environment and Jewish Life. So without further ado.
Thank you all for being here. Special thanks to Tim Profeta, who, was, in many respects, the single most accessible, thoughtful staff person in the U.S. Senate that many of us, I for 35 years, have ever worked with. And his inspiration and practicality and ability to listen to different perspectives are an enormous gift to an extraordinary institution. So we're here for you, Tim. Doing religion here in a short period of time and environment is something of a challenge. The first one was I was looking over Peter and Bill's list and discovered that obviously the religious community and certainly religious leaders had to be categorized as narcissists and regulators. There's an edge to that. It pushes some buttons for all of you, perhaps. The relationship between of environment and religion, could seem dangerous or hopeful. There's a lot to discuss about it in the context of this. George Bernard Shaw was famously approached by a colleague who said, "My dear Shaw, I've been asked to speak before the Royal Academy of Letters about my life's work, but they've only given me 10 minutes. How can I, possibly convey such understanding over so many years in 10 minutes?" And Shaw said, "Speak very slowly." I don't know what that means for me, but I'll speak fast. Whatever you say about the religious community and religion at this time, as Jim Carroll, the National Book Award winner, wrote shortly after 9/11, all at once the widely held 20th century assumption that religion would go increasingly irrelevant seemed naive. The centrality of religious life on earth had made itself very clear in a short time, and the 2004 elections may have reinforced this. Now, so what inevitably I have to kind of do, and started to impatiently before, is to really expand the perspective on these issues, which is what religious imagination tries to do, and allow us to look at a meta or larger frame as we move in and out of more short-term, immediate considerations. And for that, I would like to actually cite a non-religious authority. In 1991, it was an honor to meet with Václav Havel shortly in his position as president. And I had a little chance to sort of talk about our thing. We were just starting there, the partnership. And sometime later, I received this statement back from him. It would be unfair to ignore the numerous projects for averting environmental dangers. However, all attempts of this kind have one thing in common. They do not touch the seed from which the threats sprout, but merely try to diminish their impact. It is my deep conviction that the only option is a change in the sphere of the spirit, in the sphere of human conscience. We must develop a new understanding of the true purpose on earth. Perhaps the issue is a crisis of respect for the moral order, a crisis of respect for any kind of authority higher than our own earthly being with its material and thoroughly ephemeral interests. In the process, we have lost our certainty that the universe, nature, existence, our own lives, are works of creation that have meaning and purpose. I am not an expert on religion, but it seems to me that the major faiths have much more in common than that they are willing to admit. They share a basic point of departure, that this world and our existence are not freaks of chance, but rather part of a mysterious yet integral act. And they share a kind of catalog of moral imperatives that this mysterious act implies. Perhaps one way out of our current bleak situation could be found by searching for what unites the various religions. Then we could cultivate human existence, while at the same time cultivating the planet on which we live, suffusing it with the spirit of this ethical common ground, what I would call a common spiritual and moral minimum. Could this be, he ends, a way to stop the blind perpetual motion dragging us toward hell? It's a wonderful statement from a poet president, and it clearly defines a long-term dynamic. When Nixon first went to China, Kissinger had a long conversation with the foreign minister, Zhou Enlai, about democracy. It was very animated, so I'm told. And at the end of the conversation, Kissinger said, "Surely, Mr. Foreign Minister, you must agree that the French Revolution was a success." And Zhou Enlai replied, "Too soon to tell." So this is just to say that we are, among other things here, struggling with, on the one hand, understanding the urgency of situations as they're thrust upon us, but not forgetting that the larger agenda is, to many of us, nothing less than the transformation of human understanding of place and purpose, and how our social institutions and our economy reflects that understanding. For the religious community, there is, that frame of long-term urgency. But I should say, at 12:45, I have to be on a press conference, which is called by the Academy of Evangelical Scientists and Ethicists. And it's a press conference with Jewish leaders about the Endangered Species Act. And the existence of evangelical scientists and ethicists may be surprising in some secular circles. I'm not trying to be cute, but the creation, Bible, intelligence, design struggle is such that maybe it's not known that there are Christians who teach conservation and Christians who teach biology. They're going to be on a press conference talking about the Endangered Species Act. And I'm reading you to give you a sense of what it's like when religion addresses these questions in an immediate, like an hour from now. Just some words from that statement and testimony. They write, it gets a little biblical. If in the beginning was the Word, all life here is a tangible expression of that Word. The natural world then can be said to be a form of divine utterance. But if creation is God's word, the willful destruction of any species censors God's vocabulary, circumscribes God's messages to God's children, obstructs our conversation with our Creator. Indeed, with creation as divine manuscript, Mr. Chairman, every willing permanent destruction of a species is the equivalent of tearing a page from the last Bible and burning it. It's a different kind of language than will appear before the House Resources Committee. And we're hoping it has some, at least, surprise impact. Russell Train mentioned this earlier. There is, not time to talk about, a significant movement among conservative Christians and evangelical Christians in particular in addressing environmental issues, partly because they've overcome, frankly, the legacy and the impact of a secular environmentalism, which over the years has not shown much interest in religious life, which is driven by policy and science, which is sometimes culturally elite, and which has kind of countercultural kind of implications. So there's been a lot for conservative Christians, religious people generally, to overcome in the relationship with environmentalism. What seems most important to say about what we're doing? Just factually, it was between 1990 and 1993 that religious leaders in the country really recognized the inadequacy of the religious response to these issues for a variety of reasons. Suspicion of science, being overwhelmed by the social agenda, and narcissistic and regulatory habits and attachments. But in any case, in the early 90s, we were able to move forward on this with a series of conversations, important conversations with the science community. And we moved forward establishing the partnership that I serve. And the most important priorities within this, clearly we understand that the religious community can come forward on these questions with some degree of authority, if somewhat separately from environmentalists. And that our message, as I'll say in a moment, is really different. And it does not necessarily count on immediate resonance, say, with cab drivers, although sometimes, it can go very quickly. Second of all, for us, I hope, out of our respect for the nature of this issue, this has got to be about the future of religious life itself. We're not the caboose on the green train, the environmental movement at prayer. We ought to be about bringing to the heart of religious life care for God's creation is a central component of what it must mean now and henceforth to be religious. You love your neighbor and you care for creation. So we're about, and many of us understand it this way, we're about something that fundamental in scope, and it's not necessarily changing religious life or inventing a new religion. It's just that we don't want to feel like we're being conscripted into a movement or a short-term agenda. All the more so if some of the deepest causes of this predicament are moral causes and need deeper solutions. So that's the first point. Second of all, environment defined this way is always going to be a third-tier issue in the religious community. I mean, issues of immediate human need and suffering, are kind of there. And that's either bad news, or it suggests, on the other hand, that for us, the challenge is to integrate environmental perspectives throughout religious life. So what you pray about, what you teach your kids about, how you address immigration, how you address overseas development, how you address housing, the deeper values of environment are not a special interest, as mentioned before, but they're a way of being in the world, and that they have to be as live as much in architecture as in public health, in the arts, frankly, as much as in science. What better place than a great university to affirm that scale? And so you see a lot of the activities in the religious community integrating public health and poverty and social and economic justice. In a certain sense, coming to this slowly has protected us from premature partisanship. The last thing we need is a replication of culture wars on environment. The last thing we need is red and blue religion. The last thing we need is green religion, which is a really hard headline, by the way, to escape. Every reporter wants to write about this story. It'll always be green religion, or my favorite, clergy turns green. That's when they came in. Those were the regulators. So I'm almost done. I was asked to speak before the Senate Commerce Committee by Senator McCain about climate. And he asked, I was given then 5 minutes, and he asked, why do you guys care about climate? And I had a first answer, and this is again biblical, but it was interesting to get this in the Senate Commerce Committee hearing room. First, in Genesis, God beholds creation as very good and commands us to till and tend the earth. Second, in Psalms, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Third, we have a paramount obligation to, quotes, defend the poor and the orphan, do justice to the afflicted, and to care first for the least of these. Finally, we have an obligation to the future well-being of all life on earth, God's rainbow covenant in Genesis, Noah, which I make between me and you and every living creature for perpetual generations. So stewardship, common good, justice, intergenerational equity, love. And then when I ended that, I answered McCain's question by saying, I think religiously, we probably care about this issue for the same reasons everybody else does, which was a lovely thought, at least for me to have, because I sense the power of these universal moral and ethical principles, which are at the heart of why we've been engaged in the first place. The last point, to bring these forward means to acknowledge the importance of what I call the great indoors, the inner life, the inner habitats of moral imagination and artistic imagination, and feeling what it means to be alive and to be here and to be human at this particular moment. The danger of a movement driven by science and policy is that it constricts the full resources and expressions of human imagination and purpose. We are more than that, and we're certainly more than these polls, whoever they're talking to. And it's fine, and it's very useful. But this is no way some kind of CAT scan of the fullness of human, personhood. So in a certain sense, what we're most trying to say religiously, not just to ourselves, but to everybody, is an invitation into a greater sense of depth and calling upon deeper resources. The connection between inner life and our circumstances. I was listening to the radio in April, almost done finding this quote, I thought I was listening to a report by that great famous Italian beauty, Silvia Poggioli. If you I'm glad you feel that way too. She's always been like Anna Magnani of the radio. So she's got a thing coming out of Rome, and it's something to do with the new pope. And I hear her saying something, but it interests me, and it's going to help me with a speech the next day. So I run to the radio, and I miss it. And I find my way to the internet. I find my way to the Vatican internet, and I read these words from Pope Benedict on his April 24th installation homily. First words after Pope: "The external deserts in the world are growing because the internal deserts have become so vast. Therefore, the earth's treasures no longer serve to build God's garden for all to live in, but they have been made to serve the powers of exploitation and destruction." An unexpected quote as people were looking at Pope Benedict. And so what's to say? I hope as the Institute goes forward, you will expand your conversations to engage the communities of imagination, religious imagination and artistic imagination and moral imagination, and that we do not diminish the full resources of the individual human heart, which we all know to be the single most powerful instrument for social change.
Amen. That's great. Thanks, Paul. Okay, time for one more question. If we can get the panel going, and then lunch, I promise. Yes, sir?
I think this panel has done an outstanding job in bringing different diverse views in terms of the environment. Just sort of make a point or ask a question in the sense, while everyone is going to be seeking a job and security and all of those aspects, I surely agree with that. But I think we see that when the environment, the last one was is abused, the loss of security and the loss of the environment. I mean, Katrina brought home what happens when we don't take care of the wetlands, the water resources, and some of the other aspects. So these are things that become immediate, do look like they're in the future. So I think we have to take a look at that in terms of our sort of moral compass of where we're going to go in the future.
Reactions?
I could not agree more. I think that as you go into a political and policy context, that being cognizant of the economic and global and political context that I laid out for you is essential for you to succeed within that realm. But none of the things that I laid out for you will define right or wrong. They just tell you this is the battlefield and how to play it. Again, I could not agree more with what you said.
Okay, any comments? I think this has been terrific, so please join me in thanking all.